say you're live before I mute myself.
Okay.
You're live.
Hi, welcome to QuaranCon. Glad you could join us back again. Apologies for yesterday's slight hiccup, but we're really glad that everybody could come back for today's panel, which is Diversity in Creative Worlds. So our world is a multicultural place with humans of all shapes, sizes, colours, creeds, abilities and orientation. We're asking whether that is reflected in SFF today. How has the face of inclusion changed, and how do we achieve worlds which reflect the true nature of ours? Our panellists today are Sarah Chorn, A.K. Faulkner, J.C. Kang, Intizar Kanani and Anna Smith-Spark. We're very glad Sarah could join us as well because she had an earthquake and food poisoning, so we're glad that she's recovered enough to come back to us. And Sarah, we'll start off with you if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Okay, hi, I'm Sarah Chorn. I am an author and an editor, and I run bookwormblues.net. And I don't know, I'm not that interesting, so there you go.
Lies.
I'm sure that's not true. AK?
Hi, I'm AK Faulkner. I write books and I have a very squeaky corgi who only loves speaking when mum's on the phone.
Excellent, okay. John?
Hi, I am John Conga by JC. I write multicultural fiction books, fantasy books, and then also review for Fantasy Faction.
Fantastic, thank you. Intizar?
Hi, I'm Intizar. I write young adult fantasy, and I'm locked down with everyone else right now. So I'm really glad to be here.
Great, we'll love to have you. And Anna?
Hi, I'm Anna Smith-Spark. I'm the author of these three books. I have cunningly positioned there. The Court of Broken Knives, The Tower of Living and Dying, and the House of Sacrifice, which together make up the Empires of Dust trilogy. I have multiple invisible disabilities. I'm Asperger's, dyslexic, dyspraxic, mental health issues. I've also recently been diagnosed as on the celiac spectrum, which is like being celiac, but there's a spectrum now, and I'm trying to collect spectrums. I'm on the autism spectrum and the celiac spectrum. It's like, how many spectrums can I get?
Okay, well, I think certainly it's a very diverse panel we've got here, which is absolutely what we're looking for. So before we really delve into diversity in SFF, I'd really like to ask you guys what diversity actually means to you. And John, if it's okay, we'll start with yourself.
Oh, with me, okay.
Sorry.
It's all good. I grew up in fantasy. Basically, my older brother was a big sci-fi fantasy nerd. What we had available at the time, which I loved, was Chronicles of Narnia, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings. Those were my gateways to fantasy, like Chronicles of Narnia were my gateway to fantasy. And one of the cool things about it is it makes you love fantasy, but at the same time, we weren't really seeing people who looked like us. And so I feel that when I started writing, I really wanted to include characters that looked a little bit more like me, and not just characters that look like me, because I'm obviously not I'm obviously a very good looking, but
obviously,
of various ethnic groups, various religions. So to me, diversity is a mix of different, beliefs, races, all that.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Okay, thank you for the background. Intizar?
I think like John, I grew up where the only books that seemed to reflect me involved girls who were terribly oppressed by their culture and religion and had to break out and from under the fist of their father's patriarchy or something ridiculous like that. And I didn't find myself in books. And when I first started writing fantasy, I wrote white people because that's the only people who belonged in fantasy. And they were white, and they were either believed in some fantasy god or were Christian, and they were perfectly abled, and they were all the things that we consider to be somehow normal. And it took me a lot of struggling to start building worlds where not just myself, but the people I knew and loved around me belonged. And I had grown up traveling intensively. I lived in Saudi Arabia for a while. I traveled to probably about 50 countries by the time I was 10 or 12.
Wow.
And so, I knew the world was incredibly diverse and it was beautiful, and yet I couldn't pick up a book and find that. And so for me, what is diversity? It's reflecting the actual world around us.
Yeah.
It's not creating this really weird, whitewashed, insular world where there is no intersectionality, where you can't have someone who is brown and overweight and differently abled, or and these people exist, and so the fact that we
Absolutely.
are
Lots of
erasing
them.
them is so disturbing. So
Yeah, and the fact that you've seen so many
lots.
places, that's what really heightened that for you, hasn't it? And you were just traveling and you didn't get to see that anywhere.
yeah,
So,
and it was really kind of a stunning moment when I sat back and I looked at my writing and I was like, where am I? I'm not
in your own
it's
writing,
like
it's
I
crazy.
don't allow myself to exist in this world because I've never been allowed to before. And so, yeah, I decided I was going to change that.
Oh, very powerful. Thank you. AK.
Very similar story in many ways, and obviously different in other ways. I mean, I'm of a certain age where when I was at university, the AIDS crisis hit, and every bit of fiction, almost every bit of fiction since then has pretty much been about dealing with that pain, whether it's been speculative fiction or contemporary. And the only sort of SFF I recall from when I was younger that actually had queer people in was Tanya Huff's Smoke and Mirrors series. And not a lot of Canadian SFF seemed to make it across the pond in the sort of 80s and 90s. So I only recently discovered Alana Quartet. Oh God. The guy who pushed it into my hands is going to kill me for forgetting her name.
Laura Pierce.
Thank you. Like, yeah, I just went on live YouTube and forgot Tamora Pierce's name. Well done.
We're here for you. We're here for
Thank you. Yeah, and so we're just now getting into an era where we can have stories about LGBT people that isn't, and then they died. And to me, again, I've grown up in London and around London, and not having a diverse population in fantasy feels really fake to me because I'm from London. So, and like in SAR, I've traveled quite a lot as well. So it's just, yeah, I think artificially creating fantasy worlds that intentionally then only have white, able-bodied, straight people in them is really weird.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you're saying there, how, we talk a lot about tropes in stories and books, and then, you're saying that when you do have these LGBTQ characters, they have their own tropes, even when they are there, which is quite shocking, because how much we do talk about that, and yet they still fall into it, don't they?
Yep.
So, okay, thank you. Anna?
So, I mean, for me, diversity is, as other people have said, just reality, the reality of human life, as it has always been. So I'm a historian. So the notion that Europe was just full of straight white people and basically full of men going out and doing stuff and the women were at home, that's just a total lie. That is a fiction of Victorian male upper class scholars with massive issues about sexuality and the family and about race, because they're at the height of Victorian imperialism. And it is a fantasy. When we talk a white fantasy novel, it's literally that, it's a fantasy. Always been, the world has always been incredibly diverse. People have always been traveling. The Romans were in contact with China and with India. People have always been traveling. You read accounts of, in fact, the Romans, there were several black emperors. There have been black popes. There were one of the very earliest archbishops of Canterbury in England, in Saxon England, was from North Africa. Now, unless you're going to make an incredibly complicated reason why he was a white guy in white Saxon guy in white Africa, he was North African. He was probably the first. He was one of the first English archbishops of Canterbury. There have always, in fact, been people of very diverse sexualities. When the Iliad, Achilles and Patroclus are lovers. The translations say they're friends or cousins are Victorian translations.
Yep.
They're the same translations that have all that weird stuff in the Bible where people are going on about women's navels because it's a euphemism, right?
Yeah.
Classical world is the world in which, yes, there are obviously hierarchies of sexual power. Men penetrating people was a kind of a sign of social dominance, but people are not having this concept of there's heterosexuality and there's homosexuality. Yeah. All those notions are very modern constructs by an imperialist, white imperialist European society.
Yeah, we talk about progression.
Disabled people, you know, this idea that all disabled children were exposed at birth or locked up or their parents were ashamed of them. All those awful, endless tropes of the poor kid in fantasy novels he's the prince, but his father, the king, hates him because he's disabled. None of that is true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're talking about like, or we talk a lot about progression, but actually really the way you're talking about it there, it's actually cyclical, isn't it? I mean, we've kind of gone from a much more potentially understanding society where people were more mixed. We've got very conservative and we're kind of going...
It isn't invented in the last couple of 100 years' time. It's the notion of kind of things like a notion of heterosexuality and homosexuality being bad and wrong is again essentially a Victorian evangelical construct.
Yeah,
the West imports along with imperialism.
Yeah,
a lot of this stuff that for some reason we think is it's just the way it was. It's the young generation nowadays with their progressive ideas. Actually, for most of human history, it's not been like that. It's only in the last couple of 100 years that a very small group of people have imposed this ideologies on other people. There's a whole lot of stuff in medieval English sources about really anxiety about male and female bodies. There's a lot of anxiety if a woman goes for a walk and exerts herself too much. If a woman climbs over a fence, her womb might fall out. Basically her vagina might fall outside and form a penis, and she might become fat. And there's a lot of
happens to me all the time.
I think that's what happened to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's why it's safer not to do any exercise, because
yeah, absolutely. I always worry about that.
Oh, you won't believe what happened to me yesterday. And I mean, I was
on my way home from Tesco and just fell out. So
my favourite period of that in human history is women can't get on aircraft because their wombs will fill up with air and explode.
Oh, I didn't know you could get in that way.
The patriarchy has to work really fucking hard.
But this isn't saying this is dangerous for women because it will harm them. It's saying that the male and female body is so mutable. This notion of, there is men, there is women, and never the twain shall meet. Something really problematic about this idea that you might be trans or you might be not conform to that binary. It's actually saying the body is so mutable that a woman can just go out for a walk and when whoops, she's become a man. That whole notion of it.
Is there a reversal? Because you don't want to get stuck as a man.
Sorry?
I said, is a reversal, can I just jump a few times and become a woman again?
Well, you can test it out and let us know.
I don't want to get stuck as a man.
I think you'd have to go upside down. If you do a handstand, it'll just fall back in again. You'll be all right.
So Sarah.
Be an undo.
Yes, I know. We haven't spoken to Sarah. We should do that. Sarah, so we're not going to ask us to tell us whether you've ever tried the climbing over a fence thing, but please tell us what diversity means to you.
So I fell into fantasy when I was in high school. And it was mostly because of my older brother. He is, sorry, I've got killer allergies.
Yeah, my eyes are doing the same. That's why I keep dabbing, sorry.
Yeah.
Go right ahead.
He's autistic and he's paralyzed. And so my brother has a really hard time kind of interacting with people in a normal way. He sees the world differently. And so in order to get to know him, we kind of ended up talking to each other through books. And my brother was always really into fantasy. And so that was my introduction into fantasy. He would have me read certain books because he felt a lot like the main character, or the struggle just touched him personally or something. So for me, my introduction into the genre was always based on kind of being able to talk to someone who had a very hard time talking to people. So I think because of that, I've always kind of looked at it a little differently. It hasn't always just been about having fun. For me, the stories have always been a bit about a message. I'm always looking for what this book can say to someone like my brother. And then when I got to be in my 20s, I was diagnosed with cancer, and then I ended up with a chronic illness. And so adding my own 2 issues on top of all of that has made fantasy more of a gateway to me. It's a place where people can go to experience and maybe explore a bit of the world that they wouldn't otherwise get to do. And so for me, the world is a huge place. It's really broad. It's quite wide. And if you only write books about yourself and your own experiences, then you're automatically right there, just cutting off like 99.9% of the world, of the people who need to use your book to tell someone something that they can't figure out how to put into words. The entire planet is just this huge tapestry. And for me, diversity isn't so much diverse, it's more representative. It's this is us, and this is what we put ourselves into our books, and we also put our experiences into our books. And if we can't do that, if we don't try to push ourselves to understand how other people live, then I think we're writing for ourselves more than writing for other people. And that just cuts off everyone who's like my brother and everyone who, so anyway, I don't know, I'm rambling, but
no, not at all. I think what you're saying is very
sense.
powerful.
Yes.
I think that's a relevant point. Absolutely. Okay, well, if it's okay, thank you very much, guys, for the start. I'm going to move on to our next question. Some people would argue that fantasy and science fiction have examined diversity in a way other genres haven't. That's not to say that it's achieved that goal, but perhaps it's looked at it in ways that other genres have not. How well do you think SFF has achieved that goal, past and present? Intezar, if we can start with you. I know you have an opinion on this one.
So
You all do, actually.
I think that, if you look at the very first fantasies, things like Narnia and Lord of the Rings and all, you find that actually it does a pretty terrible job of looking at diversity. And when you have people of color, they're invariably the bad guys, whether they're the orcs or the some other sort of enemy. But I do think that over the course of decades, we have seen forward movement. I think there's a lot of space for movement. I think that there were some shows like Star Trek having a character who happens to be not white on the crew is fantastic, and
that was the first interracial kiss, wasn't it? I think on television. Am I right in thinking that?
I don't know. It's one of those things that people say, and it seems.
But it's not true.
No, I believe it was actually the second.
Okay. Sorry, I'm perpetuating the lie. I'm sorry.
They were pretty quick on the uptake, but I'm really only seeing like you see a good amount of diversity nowadays, but I think that for a long time, fantasy especially relied on diversity, saying, well, we have elves and dwarves. I'm sorry, if your elves and dwarves are all white or blue, then that's not diversity, right? Diversity, and that's just thinking about diversity in terms of race as well. It's not thinking about all the other types of diversity we have. And if everyone believes in 12 gods, that's not diverse either, because everyone believes in the same 12 gods. You don't have diversity of religion. So I think we've seen a really good movement forward in the last 5 years, I would say, maybe 10 years. And there's been big things like Black Panther was a huge splash, and it was amazing because we finally had positive portrayals of a non-white society that was empowering, and that frankly everyone who should have been relating to that anyhow started relating to. So I would love to hear what other people think. I think that we are in a really good place right now. There is a lot of pushback coming from certain circles. So I think it continues to be important that as readers, we demand stories that include natural diversity. And when I say natural diversity, I mean, it's not an issue story about the girl who is LGBT or the girl who is differently able, disabled, but that your characters happen to be these things and are having these adventures and stories.
Yeah.
And that's, it's a very different kind of story. That is, I grew up, like I said, with these stories about Muslim girls who, like, their story was, oh, it's such a struggle to be a Muslim. And I was like, I don't even know what this is. It has no relation to me. And I'm going to go over here and read the Alana Quartet, because at least, this is a girl who wants a sword and she's going to, like, kick butt. And I can relate to that.
Yeah.
So, I'd love to hear what other folks think. I'm really very interested in this conversation.
Yeah. Okay, great. John, if I can come to you next then.
I'm going to echo what Intisar said, is that at least the early fantasy books I read were very much like any human race that was the enemy was usually the non-white race. So for example, in the Chronicles of Narnia, it was the Calormen, who were like very much a stand-in for Muslims. And in The Lord of the Rings, I think the orcs were supposed to represent Germans, but I could be wrong about that, or at least industrialism. But then you also have what they call the Southrons, who were kind of like, I wasn't sure if they were African or Arab, but the stand-ins at the time were very much people of color. I think now we're sort of launching into a whole new world here, a more diverse world. And as Intisar said, it's very organic and it's being introduced organically and naturally in many cases. But going back to, say, 2014, I had a conversation with Cindy Pond, who writes young adult diverse fantasy, usually with Asian protagonists. And she was saying that it's a very hard market to tap. Nobody wants to read this right now. And so in order to get a deal, a big 5 deal, it's like next to no chance whatsoever. I think it's different now. You see this now in terms of in the last couple of years. Well, I should preface this by saying that I also, in addition to being a reviewer for Fantasy Faction, Virginia McLean and we also run a site called Asian Fantasy Books, which means we read a lot of Asian fantasy books. But in the last 2 years, we've seen, for example, the Poppy Wars have come out, followed by The Descent of the Crane, Spin the Dawn, Jade City. There are a lot of big 5 Asian fantasies right now. So I think, and outside of Asian fantasy, we also have K.S. Veloso's Wolf of Oren Yarrow. But then outside of Asian fantasies, we also have Children of Blood and Bone with African fantasy, Even Winter's Rage of Dragons. So I think we're in a better place than we were, say, in the 1980s.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And AK?
I think one of the things that I always noticed with fantasy in the past versus fantasy now is that actually we're also giving more diverse people better roles within those fantasy. Like, I mean, apart from anything else, women, we're not even talking about like the diversity we're talking about in this panel, but just women in fantasy. I mean, I read books growing up 70s, 80s, and invariably there was going to be an on-page rape. And, it's like, oh, yeah, here comes her rape,
and then she can be strong after that.
Here's my rape. Oh, no, then the guy can rescue her.
Oh, okay, right, sorry.
She doesn't get to be strong after that. And I think we're getting a lot more diverse books now, but they're, as John said yesterday, they're almost all in young adult. And they need to start creeping into adult. And I don't know if that's because we're going to have to wait for people who are reading YA now to then start looking for those things. Yeah, to look for those things in their regular, because I naturally am writing adult diverse books. So
we should ask this question again in 5 years.
Come back to me.
Okay.
I'll be like Alexander Siddig in What We Left Behind, where he just sits there and goes, yeah, it would be nice if people had appreciated Deep Space Nine 20 years ago when we were making it.
I like it. Okay.
Yeah, I think we're getting there, but publishers are very much mostly putting it in young adult.
Yeah,
and I think the combination of factors there is the assumption that only Generation Z wants to read these things, and also maybe sort of dipping a toe in the market, the way that Tor dipped their toe in by starting doing like ebook novellas to begin with, and then they sort of graduated onto printing them and making novels. So I think publishers are gently testing the markets and finding that there's a reception for diverse books, but I still think it needs to grow. I think we need to close the empathy gap. People need to read about protagonists that are not themselves, and other people need to read about protagonists who are themselves, because we all know how to empathize with cis white men.
I
And
don't.
people John, you just need to try harder.
I'm just a racist, basically. That's what my wife says. So, she snorted at me.
Sarah, are there any books which particularly influenced your perception of diversity? I know you said that you started off with your brother and things, but was there a book that you first came across that kind of just said, oh God, this is so wrong, was there something in particular? Or likewise really went, this is what I want to see? Was there anything that did that for you?
Oh, I think, yeah, there was a series, a trilogy a few years ago called the Revolution Trilogy, and I can't for the life of me remember the author's name, but it was based in kind of a near future world, and all of these people ended up with different abilities for one reason or another, and they all had God, my allergies. I'm so sorry.
It's okay, don't worry.
Did you say all the characters had allergies, or you have allergies?
Oh, it's killing me. It's like the wind is blowing just enough to make talking hard. But the series was based in England, and these people ended up getting these new abilities, but every new ability they had like a side effect or a negative aspect of it. And nobody was really disabled per se, but there were people who were definitely more comfortable in their bodies than other people. And it was really fantastic because it kind of just covered the gamut of everything that impacts people who are disabled. And I think she did it really, really well. And it was the first time I'd actually ever seen a trilogy that was basically just full of disabled people owning it. And just loud and proud, and here I am. And that was really the one that made me think, you know, people like me belong in your books too. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that we don't really hear often enough. Like, we get in these huge Twitter discussions, like we as in the genre in general, get into these huge Twitter discussions about diversity, and inevitably you'll see me pop in at one point in this discussion and say, if your diversity does not include disabled people, it's not diverse. It just isn't. And I think in a lot of ways that's where we are still having a big problem with diversity. It's getting better and we're seeing more of it, but there's still a lot of books where the only thing that you see of the disabled person is them being mercy killed. Oh, they wouldn't want to live without a leg, so let's have this really sad scene where we kill the person without a leg because living without a leg is just the worst thing ever. And that's just something, it needs to go. But we also don't talk about it that often. And so there's all these diversity discussions, and it's wonderful, but it's very, very rare that I see a disabled person on a diversity panel talking about diversity. And it's very rare still that I read a fantasy book where the disabled person isn't shunted off to the side or mercy killed or given some small role, or look at how strong they are in spite of, or they're blind, but they have this special second sight that makes up for it, or something like that. And so for me, that trilogy, the Revolution trilogy, and I am so freaking sorry I can't remember the author's name, but that was really the book that showed me that we really don't need to be pushed off to the side. That
well, I'm really looking forward to you and John's collaboration with the gang, with the disabled leader. I'm thinking, with the email chat, I'm so looking forward to that collaboration, I can't tell you. Anna, how about yourself? Is there something that you thought, yes, this encapsulates it, or something that really turned you off and just said, no, this is why this needs to be addressed?
Okay, so I mean, two separate points. First of all, to talk about, I mean, the great classic fantasies, Lord of the Rings. I mean, I think, yes, they are profoundly non-diverse books, yes. and that whole notion of other races, that notion of having, I mean, race is again, race is a modern invention. There's no such thing as a white race and a black race. So when people talk about, oh, well, we've got this other race, the elves, I mean, that's like saying, you might as well be saying, well, we've got some horses in the book, so hey. Race does not exist, guys. So when you start talking about these false, well, we've got elves and dwarves, I mean, that's just rubbish. Anyway, but okay, so these classic books, they are totally non-diverse. What a lot of classic fantasy literature, I think, was doing is actually a way of engaging with and critiquing imperialist ideology. I mean, if you think, so someone like William Morris, his utopian fantasy, he's writing these medieval fantasy novels as a way of talking about utopian socialism and non-industrialization. He's using that to critique in late Victorian and Edwardian imperialism. If you look at The Lord of the Rings, that is a book which is coming out of the First World War. It is a political response to industrialization, mechanized warfare, the whole issue, the notion of the ring, this ring of power. I mean, in some ways, what is that if not the embodiment of a kind of male, masculine, hierarchical, imperialist ideology of power, and the notion, and that is being shown to be evil and problematic. If you look at something like R. Scott Baker's Second Apocalypse novels, they are profoundly about toxic masculinity. There are no women. Women are utterly erased. Many of the characters in them are profoundly homophobic, and that's the point. World in which, when I read a lot of these whites are very much, these are just white male warriors striding around, hitting each other with swords. That ain't a good thing. What that is absolutely kind of that nightmare of that Game of Thrones nightmare of a load of white dudes just hacking each other with swords forever. It's a political thing, and it's not good. It's negative. It's not. If you watch the Conan films, I mean, they give him a German accent, for Christ's sake. What kind of how big can the sign that says a big white dude with a sword going around killing black people is maybe a bit problematic?
Yeah, that's a fairly good analogy.
So I guess I always receive those texts like that there is something much more problematic going on in them. And that certainly, so my trilogy, and I would say actually one thing, I have not been able to sell it in any Eastern European country because it would, I suspect, be illegal in most Eastern European countries. It has centre stage a black-skinned gay couple who are just, of all the things that are going on in their lives, the fact they're black and the fact they're gay has got absolutely nothing to do with anything. It's it is actually a very diverse feminist epic fantasy, and it's been published by 2 different Big 4 publishers. It's been translated by a big German publisher. It's never been an issue. And it is a critique. It is my engagement with what I think is implicit of a lot of classic, very non-diverse fantasy, that actually there's more going on than just, hey, the big guy with the sword striding around saying you are of another race and therefore lesser and I will kill you. That's not necessarily great, and the book is not necessarily. And if people read that and think, well, that clearly, that is how I shall live, that's maybe them rather than the book, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair point, actually.
A lot more complexity in talking, but I'm going on for ages, but the that Sarah was talking about is something that really, it is the kind of one of the last, that so many books, again, think about Game of Thrones. There's Tyrion. Tyrion's father is absolutely ashamed of the fact his son and his father just hates him, disowns him. He's the laughing stock. He can only be in this kind of, he's profoundly unhappy. You think about, that's not true. That's never been true. Throughout history, most people, you have a child, that child has a disability. You don't hate that child.
No.
Maybe your life might be more difficult. Maybe sometimes you might think, God, why can't you be a normal child? And any parent who has never at some point shouted, why can't you just be normal? whether their child is disabled or not, frankly.
I'm sure I've heard my mum say that at some point.
But, you know, that notion that's so common in fantasy, our hero who will prove himself to the warrior society around him by showing that just because he's missing like one thumb or something, or has a twisted foot, or is not even in any way recognized to be disabled, just is a bit weaker than some of the other people, he will still triumph, and one day he will come back and show the people that they are wrong about him.
Yeah.
Can't he just not have to do all that stuff because his parents love him, even though he's missing his thumb? Because frankly, most parents kind of do love their children, even if they're missing something like their thumb.
We would hope so anyway.
Weird.
Yeah. Okay. So it's going to lead me on to something then. So we think we've established, you know, that diversity is something that, you know, it needs to reflect. But some authors have faced criticism when attempting to create diverse worlds, dealing with potentially accusations of cultural appropriation, or they've created a character that's deaf or blind, and they don't have that experience to speak of. So what advice would you then give to writers in approaching that issue with sensitivity? I mean, Sarah, I'll come to you first, because you've talked about you want to see people talking about more disabled characters. If they're not disabled, would that be difficult for them at all? How do you think they could handle that?
Well, I mean, it's always going to be a little challenging to write the other, to write what you aren't. And there's always going to be some hurdles that you're going to have to jump over. But the fantastic thing about the internet is that it exists and that it can connect people. And so there is a group of people who do not like sensitivity readers. And for the life of me, I will never understand that argument. Because the first thing I did when I wrote a trans character for my book that's coming out is I talked to like 4 trans people and then a whole bunch of others afterwards and said, why don't you tell me about your experience so I can try and get this right? So the easiest way to get something as right as you can when you're writing the other is by talking to people who actively live that life. If you want to write a deaf character, talk to someone who's deaf and ask them questions about what it's like to be deaf every day. If you want to talk to someone who can't walk, there are a whole bunch of people who can't walk, myself included, who would be like, please talk to me, because for the love of God, I want to see someone like me portrayed in a book accurately. But more than that, like, my first book, Serafina's Lament, is based off of a genocide in Ukraine and Stalinism. Like, there is not one cell in my body that is Ukrainian or Russian, not one part of me. I am the furthest thing from that I can ever. So for me, it was doing a whole bunch of research, probably like too much research, and then talking to survivors who were like 1 or 2 generations removed, but their parents had survived this genocide, and just getting firsthand accounts from the internet. The people have saved journals and where they wrote about, my neighbor had to eat his son today because he was starving to death. And these real world accounts, I mean, it's all there. It's not, it's intimidating and it can be hard, but the internet exists, and people are really excited to hear themselves and see themselves portrayed in books. So by all means, do your research, find sensitivity readers, ask the questions that you might feel uncomfortable asking, but be nice about it. And I think in my opinion, that's really where it starts.
Okay, thank you. Intisar, can I ask you to jump in here? I mean, so where's the line, do you think? So somebody trying to show diversity, how do they avoid slipping into cultural appropriation, for example?
I think, you know, like Sarah said, a lot of it is about research and learning about whatever or whoever it is you want to portray. But it's also about questioning your implicit bias. So if you're writing a book and you're like, oh, I'm gonna have a Black character and she's gonna be a sassy woman who, well, hold on. Like, why did you default to that character? Just stop yourself and ask, why did I default to that? Why did I default to this fate for them? Like, why does my LGBTQ character have to be the one that dies? Like, what, you know, it's really, we like to assume that we are not victims of the societies around us that teach us certain fates or certain stories about people, but we all are. We all carry some level of implicit bias about someone somewhere.
Yeah.
And
About
so,
ourselves.
you know, we have to unpack that. When you are ready to write a book about someone who is not you, which you should be ready to do right now, you have to be willing to face yourself and what you are carrying that maybe you shouldn't be carrying. So like Sarah, I hire sensitivity readers. I just turned in edits on my second novel with Harper Teen. And the main character is disabled, and there was no way I was going to move forward without sensitivity reads. And I'd done research, and I've been writing this book for about 8 years, in some way, shape, or form. And I had 2 different sensitivity readers. I actually went back to one of those sensitivity readers and had her do a second read because I changed a chunk of the book, and I was like, I don't want to get this wrong.
That's fair.
It's about respect. It's about sensitivity and compassion, and recognizing that people are going to be impacted by the story you tell.
Mhm.
And we chatted about this yesterday, when we were trying to make up for not being able to
Not being able to see each other. Yeah.
yeah, but we talked about do no harm and build compassion, and those are kind of the things that that as an author I function by. And by do no harm, I don't mean that I don't intend to make my reader cry at some point.
Sure.
Right.
You want them weeping into their book.
I'm very happy to break your heart into pieces, but my goal is that my book should not actually hurt the people who relate with it. That you shouldn't read my book and be like, that's not my experience, or now I'm going to have to live with this stereotype that other people have. So I just had a book release in March called Thorn, and the main character comes from a history of abuse. And I wrote this in a time frame when the vast majority of books about abuse in YA involved the main character being like, I'm over that now. I'm going to have perfectly healthy relationships. And I was like, what are we doing?
Secretly, Intisar and I have written the same book.
High five. So, I mean, first of all, trauma does not work like that. No trauma works like that. You cannot just wake up one morning and change your experience like you're getting dressed. It doesn't work that way. And so you have a whole generations of young people thinking, what is wrong with me that I can't just shake it off? And you have whole generations of young people going, what's wrong with my friend that she just can't get over it and be normal now? And that is so hurtful. That's the kind of harm I'm trying to avoid. And right there, abuse is, we don't usually think of it as a diverse reality, but it is. It
should be incorporated into it. You're right.
It's an experience, and you have to be sensitive and aware of what you're doing when you portray that. So my character does not wake up one morning and have perfectly gotten over her past.
Fair
it's
enough.
a process.
Yeah.
And there are some things that you will never get past, and it's important that we understand that and we accept that and we teach that, because otherwise we do harm to those around us. So I've probably gone on long enough.
No, you're fine, you're good. John, if I can come to you for a second, just asking, sort of continuing on that thread though, but asking if that has influenced your writing at all, as you've experienced that, when you've spoken to people, what impact does that actually have on you as a writer?
In terms of writing people other than myself?
Yeah, or getting feedback from people, and how have you kind of taken that forward?
Okay. I would like to say I want to co-sign much of what Intisar said in terms of there is a lot of implicit bias in our approach to the world in general. And I would like to also add that there might be certain implicit biases we have about ourselves, things that we might be wrong about ourselves because we've been shaped by certain experiences. That, for example, I am a straight Asian male, I think. But I do not, my experience doesn't represent every straight Asian male or even every straight Asian Chinese American male. And so I think that it's a matter of understanding, knowing a lot of people in that picture. So I can't even say I can write an Asian story 100% correctly. I've lived in Asia or whatever for 4 years, but I will not necessarily have the same experience as somebody else. So I don't necessarily speak for everyone. And so I think that the implicit bias is not just about other groups, but even within my own group as well. In terms of other groups, I've written LGBT characters, I've written Black characters. I definitely try to get reader feedback. My most recent series has just been a series of novellas, which I put out really fast. And I do have a few LGBT readers, and I ask them, I put in scenes and I was like, do you find anything problematic with this? Or how would you improve this in terms of how you would like to be portrayed? And so that's the way I like to do it in terms of talking to other people of other races. Another thing that we had mentioned was about cultural appropriation. And I am totally fine if someone who is not a male, cisgender Asian writes about me, as long as they've done their research. I'm fine with that. And I'm very much willing to talk to people about that. What kind of bothers me is sometimes when people try to commodify something, they're trying to do, it's there for the gimmick. It's like, oh, I have this Asian male, so that makes my story different, but they don't bother to make the character different based upon the ethnic.
Right, okay, yeah. Okay, Anna, what about yourself? Do you feel that your writing has been influenced at all by feedback or changes you've seen?
Well, so I don't get any feedback from anyone ever at all. I don't get
Okay.
no one sees my books until they go to my agent or my editor. So I kind of completely don't see the point of create the whole wonderful thing about fantasy worlds is we can make them operate any way we want them to do. So what the point of reproducing a particular set of deeply unpleasant bigotries we happen to have to live with in those worlds is? I cannot see the point. I get very kind of, oh well, all worlds must be preferred, and then maybe at some point our hero must stand up and speech about
Sorry.
so that kind of all worlds are homophobic, and at some point our characters will perhaps talk about the fact that, hey, do you think maybe homophobia is bad? Why replicate a bigotry? Why not just not have a homophobic society? So yeah, I mean, in my books, it's an incredibly bleak, unpleasant, nihilistic world, but people aren't in the remotest bit homophobic. And in fact, there's a lot of people are very open about sexual desires for people of the same sex and of the opposite sex. Why would I bother replicating a kind of bigotry? I also think there's kind of an issue with that kind of sense of, well, I'll just so people have done to death recreating a fantasy of medieval white Europe, which is a complete fantasy because there was never such thing as medieval white Europe. So now we'll just recreate a fantasy of, we'll take another culture and just change the name of their gods a bit and give them a bit of magic, but we'll still have essentially the same tropes of the person with the special bloodline who is the chosen one, who is better than everyone else, and ends up becoming okay. So they end up becoming, they're a woman of colour who ends up becoming queen, but we're still having the same hierarchical system where because of their special bloodline, they ended up being the special one. That is still still the same problematic ideology. You're just saying, yeah, but hey, I've dressed it up a bit by
a different culture or whatever, a slightly different background
of another culture, but still with all the same incredibly implicit problems about hierarchy, about the way that power operates, about essentially a kind of liberal capitalist fantasy of the big man.
Yeah.
The fact you're telling me, I mean, I did have some issues with Black Panther about that, for example, that we still have an incredibly militaristic a society where we appear to have a royal family and it's all to do with bloodline. No one's questioning
I hadn't
anyone.
really thought of that actually, but yeah, it's a fair point.
And we're just, and yet, because we've created a kind of complicated and involved culture which happens to be African, somehow we can somehow ignore a lot of political issues about militarism, about monarchy, because it's because he's a black dude rather than a white dude. And I find that kind of, there's a sense of it being quite a kind of superficiality around diversity of skin color and of culture, whereas the ideological assumption about the top man still remains in place. Kind of, I don't kind of sure that telling that same story just with people with lots of interesting skin colors and interesting name pronunciations of their names compared to Lancelot is actually getting us particularly further.
Yeah, well, that's actually, I think that's actually leads into one of the other questions, which I'll say, and then AK, if you want to start us off talking about it, was obviously Barnes and Noble very recently experienced rather a large backlash, and rightly so, over their Black History Month book covers, changing their books to feature characters with a darker skin colour, and I think we could say that was a superficial fix at best, and probably downright insulting, actually, as an overall idea for me personally anyway. So does that put into question then that whether or not the industry is committed to real change? You know, just putting a black cover on Frankenstein doesn't make it diverse. So AK, what would you say to that? Sorry, it starts laughing.
I will laugh solid for 5 minutes and then we can pass over to someone else.
Okay.
I mean, slapping a black cover, a black character on books that were written by and explicitly featuring white characters doesn't do a damn thing to fix things, when we have, for instance, Ben Aronovich having written about a black man as his main character for like, what, 10, 15 years, I think Rivers of London started and has been going on, but no publisher will put that black man on the cover. I mean, it's for maybe for black characters in books months, you could have actually promoted some characters in books that are black. I know it's a radical idea and it might never catch on, but just this once, maybe we could try something different and actually try to sell some characters who aren't white, because they do exist and they are out there. And I mean, the covers for Rivers of London are absolutely gorgeous. The UK covers are beautiful. The American covers, a little bit weird. They kind of look like this sort of thriller, like it's actually Greg Hurwitz, and they've put the guy in shade so that you can't see what color he is. And they actually put out 2 different versions of this cover. They actually tried it with a clearly black model and it didn't sell particularly well, so then they put him in shade. But if you look at the hand, you can still tell it's the same model. And that one, it sold great guns. But in the UK, we didn't even put a person on the cover. We just put this very pretty picture of London with blood all over it, which works for the books. But yeah, so Barnes and Noble really could have just figured out which of the books they sell actually has black protagonists in it, and maybe made a list of those. That could be really cool.
Yeah, what a novel idea indeed.
I know, I should definitely work in marketing. I think I've got this sussed
so.
out.
Barnes and Noble will be calling any minute.
They will. They call me.
Okay, would anyone else like to jump in on that point?
I think really though the clear point here is that as readers, we need to be voting with our wallets, right? We need to be buying those books that have people of color on the covers. We need to, that have different, differently abled people on the cover, who have all these different types of diversity in the book, and done well, and on the cover. And we need to make an actual effort to find those books and buy them and show our publishers that there is a market and there is a future and they need to be investing in it. And it's just a very it's a very simple thing to say, but especially in these times, it's harder to do. It's really important. If you can't yourself support authors, remember that you can suggest a purchase to your library. Just check it out from your library. A library keeps track of what books are checked out, and that's how they decide what they're buying. And libraries are huge buyers. So, you have multiple venues in which to support authors of diverse backgrounds and authors who are writing diverse stories. So, I mean, do that, because that makes a difference. That is what will eventually convince Barnes and Noble to feature books with people of color on the front who that are actually about people of color.
Yeah. not just sort of paying lip service. And...
Yeah, there's a thing that I noticed recently. I read a magazine called Current Archaeology, which is about recent archaeological finds in Britain. And virtually more and more they're doing they're doing kind of DNA examination, and you can tell a lot about where someone's from the diet and the mineral traces in their bones. So every article where they've done this will begin, at some point it will say, this is a surprisingly diverse community. And you're like, you have said that in every article.
Yeah, why are you still surprised?
I've been doing this for 10 years and I'm still consistently amazed.
Every time. Oh, medieval Northumbria was a surprisingly diverse community. Medieval York was a surprisingly diverse community. Roman East Anglia was a surprisingly diverse community. Like, you said this every article. Maybe you could just accept and get over the fact that it's a constant surprise to people.
The new headline needs to be, we are surprisingly continuing to whitewash history. I think that's what we need to be surprised about now, because we've unearthed as if it was ever truly hidden, the fact that the world has been diverse since it began.
No. You see, what happened was we found these two skeletons and they were buried together in a way that suggests that they were a couple, but we've tested them and they were both male.
No.
They must have just been really good friends.
Or
they were accidentally buried together. I'm not really sure what you're going on
actually,
about.
there was a very interesting thing. They found a Viking woman buried so she was buried with a comb and some jewelry, and she was buried with a sword.
Mm-hmm.
So people started. Now, on one hand, it was wonderful that the archaeologists were like, well, maybe she was trans, maybe she was gay, and she was considered to be some kind of, straight. But all of it was about maybe she was this really strange, secret and weird. It's like, well, maybe she just quite liked wearing dresses and having a sword. Maybe she had 2 kids and a husband and liked simply vanilla sex, but she had a sword. But no, there must be some really special explanation for this. It's like, maybe it would be really cool to think maybe she was trans, maybe she was gay, maybe she was completely non-binary. On the other hand, but me, oh my God, John's gone upside down again.
Oh, John.
I'm running out of battery.
Right,
so
guys,
I
listen, we're 1 minute to 5. I would love to keep this running. It's been absolutely amazing. I didn't get through most of my questions, so it was just so fascinating. So listen, I want to say thank you so much. I think the discussion has been absolutely fascinating. I really feel like I've learned a lot from just listening to your guys' perspective, and I certainly have a lot to think about going away. So thank you, Anna, John, Sarah, AK and Intizar. It's been absolutely fantastic. If you'd like to know more about today's authors, all of their links are in the comments below. I would like to remind you to go visit Artists Alley. Thank you for joining QuaranCon. Our next panel is Handling Death and Romance, just coming up. Then Own Voices, Virtual versus Cultural Adaptation. We've got Adrian Tchaikovsky and AM Justice, and then we have genre after that. So it's a full evening planned. Thank you so much, and that's us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.